Friends, just a fair warning that part of this conversation might be a little bit provocative. So if you have little children around and you don't want them to hear certain things, you might want to put on those earmuffs. All right? See you soon.
I have a couple concepts in my head right now. The big one being pleasure activism.
Yeah.
And then that being a little, there's an aspect I feel like of pleasure activism and activist theology in terms of inventing new ways or imagining new ways to do activism.
Mm-hmm.
However, from your perspective and all of your work in being adjacent to queer culture, is there any sort of polyamorous framework that fits into activist theology?
We're like going there. I love it. So I will say that activist theology seeks to undermine heteropatriarchal monogamy, the kind of toxic monogamy that keeps us all from experiencing intimacy. The kind of toxicity that keeps men from becoming friends with other men and women becoming friends with other women. So it does seek to undermine that. I have not used polyamorous as a term for myself because it is a super white term, even though there are black polyamoring people. I much prefer non-monogamy to refer to myself and to refer to my orientation to the world as a theologian and ethicist. And what I mean by that is I don't believe that one person can be my everything. They can be a lot, but they can't be everything to me. So how do we create conditions for a relationship to hold the nuances of other intimacies? And I feel like that is a big part of what I do in my current relationship. Is we both have a non-monogamous orientation to the world, but are very much in deep commitment to one another for each other's flourishing. But we had to arrive at that. We didn't just wake up and say, let's have a non-monogamous orientation to the world. And I think that my work holds that type of non-monogamous orientation because I'm not tied to just one strand of thought. I don't think that one particular philosophy can be everything. And so, shall we say, I flirt with the multiplicity of thinkers, and being methodologically promiscuous allows me to have a non-monogamous orientation with the work of theology and ethics. Does that answer your question?
Welcome to the Permission to Be podcast, everybody.
Hello, and welcome to Permission to Be. I'm your host, Becka Epley, joined today by my good friend and co-host, Tommy Allgood. Permission to Be exists to be a space of hope for those journeying to find their true, authentic selves. We hope that the story shared here will inspire you on your own journey and help you unlock the permission to be who you have always truly been. That was beautiful.
So now that we've covered non-monogamy, where shall we go next? I'm going to take a sip of bourbon.
Joining us today is Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, and we are so excited to have them with us. Dr. Robyn is one of the founders of Activist Theology, a theologian, an ethicist, an author, a speaker, an educator. I would say also a healer in the areas of theology.
Amen.
So, Dr. Robyn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to see where our conversation takes us. We've already started with a hot and juicy topic of polyamory and non-monogamy. Thank you, Tommy.
I mean, these are things I pontificate about often.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah.
Your answer was like poetry. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can I just add something to that?
Of course.
That in our religious tradition of Christianity, there is a overwhelming oneness that permeates all of the discourse. In marriage, you become one with your spouse. In God, you become one with Christ. And so I want to trouble that because I think that oneness and that history of oneness has not only silenced the tradition of women being in our religious history, but it's also silenced LGBTQ people. And this oneness has got us into a lot of trouble because it's also erected a kind of supremacy culture that says that theology equals whiteness. And so I want to trouble those roots in such a way so that we overcome the logic of oneness, so that we can hold multiplicity of identities. Like myself, right? I'm born of a Mexican immigrant and an Anglo man. I'm a mixed race Latinx. I move in the world as a white person unless I'm speaking Spanish. So either I'm a white Latinx or a mestizaje person or a white passing Latinx. Some people are not wanting me to call myself white passing because that does an injustice to anti-racism work. I'm still figuring that out for myself.
Okay, there's a couple things that already in our conversation that I'm craving a little bit more explanation on. This is rich, and we're not even 5 minutes in. My gosh. Okay, you said a couple things. So you said polyamory was associated, you associated that with whiteness, and then you also said that alluding to yourself as white, passing does injustice to anti-racism work. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because whoa.
Well, in the communities in the queer culture that I've been a part of, when I encounter polyamorous people, they're overwhelmingly white. And so I have rejected that term for myself and have instead used non-monogamous. One of the other reasons I use non-monogamy is to counter the singularity or the oneness or the logic of oneness in the tradition of Christianity. That if we can, it's like the via negativa, negative theology. If we can negate, then what can we say? This is apophatic theology. And I think that there are a lot of people who have had different experiences with the polyamory community. There are people of color who identify as polyamorous. I'm just one of those people who prefer non-monogamy because my work is trying to disrupt and dismantle heteropatriarchal bullshit that is bound up in toxic monogamy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So your other question was about white passing? So I've always referred to myself as someone with proximity to whiteness because of my skin color. And I get read a certain way. So I've always called myself a person who is white passing. I'm not brown like my mother. My mother cannot pass as white, but I can pass as white. Culturally, I'm like an old gay man, like an old gay Latino man. That's culturally, but But when you see me in the world, you might think, oh, that's a white person. So I'm doing some work around, well, how do I talk about myself if I'm not white culturally or ethnically? How do I talk about myself? Because the way I'm seen, until I come out as a Latinx, people are thinking that is another white person talking to us, because what we see creates reality for so many people.
Yeah.
And we don't have, I mean, we already don't know how to sit with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, much less mixed race people who have a multi-ethnic makeup. We don't know how to sit with the pieces of people. And so for me, I'm trained as a Latin American liberation theologian in the United States. And so I'm heavily informed by Latin American thinking, heavily informed by the Chicano movement. And I, grew up with a Mexican mom. So culturally, I am oriented in a certain way that is not white. And I think that when we talk about whiteness, we need, it deserves some nuance, because to be a white person does not necessarily mean you're oriented in the same way as your ethnic heritage. And I mean, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that.
Yeah, I wanna piggyback off of that, and I have no idea even where to go, because it gets so foggy and complicated, and it's always tied back to identity and dignity and existing in the world. And I find it so interesting that you say that. As I listen to you, as I know of you, as I've been adjacent and proximate to your work, to operate as a queer person, do you accept that label as queer?
Yeah, I identify as trans and queer.
Okay, right.
Okay.
So sorry, we didn't go over pronouns either.
Yeah, they, them.
Yeah, so Dr. Robin's pronouns are they, them. In all of that, when we talk about the work of anti-racism, and though it has this rootedness in race, how has your queerness, your transness impacted the work in anti-racism for you? Also being a person on the margins.
Yeah, when I first entered the movement 20 years ago, I was living in Chicago, and I was surrounded by a lot of white people who were fighting for LGBT rights, but really they were fighting for lesbian and gay rights. And, I wondered to myself, where are the people who look like me, both in gender presentation and orientation and racially? I just didn't see a multi-ethnic makeup in these organizing spaces. And so then, of course, marriage equality emerged during 2005, 6, 7, 8, and still overwhelmingly white. And I really felt that my job was to ask the questions. Where are the people of color? As we know, because the movement chose marriage equality as the thing to go for, we know that there's lots of homophobia in communities of color. And so the people who came out for marriage equality were the dominant culture. Yeah, there were some people of color who came out in support of marriage equality, but overwhelmingly it was a white movement.
Mhm.
And so I think right now, living with the brutality, the police brutality and violence against trans women of color, which has always been the case,
Yeah.
I think we really have to reconcile our histories, because on the one hand, our histories have served the dominant culture. They have not served the underside. And, you know, like Tony McDade, a trans man who was killed in Tallahassee, Florida by the police.
Yeah.
Why isn't his name being lifted up? Why aren't we saying his name? Why is he being misgendered? And I think it's because, as a movement, a couple things. We don't know what to do with violence against trans people. And that's the normative script. So when you look at media representation, the only kind of narrative media knows how to do or how to represent trans people is through violence. Why? Because that's the dominant representation in our culture. Or as sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, you know, there's... If we're really talking about becoming a movement to heal our culture, to heal our world, I think we have to deal with these narratives of marginalized people in a robust way. I think if we don't, we fall prey to capitulating to the dominant narrative that silos these people, silos marginalized people in violent ways. And so the movement has deeply impacted me. I haven't always seen trans women in leadership. I haven't always seen trans people being lifted up as people who are strategic. I've seen cis white gay men and cis white lesbians being lifted up, but I haven't seen those who might be on the underside of history being lifted up.
Being a cis female, I don't have a lot to say except that Netflix came out with Disclosure last week.
Yes, I co-sign that.
And in continuing education for myself, wow.
Yeah.
The movie the documentary, for those of us who have not studied and realized our history in regards to the trans community, it shows over and over and over again how our society and how our film industry specifically has portrayed trans individuals. We have become receivers of the movies and the personas on screen, and we've accepted that. And I believe that's how the dominant culture has responded to trans people, by laughing. It's a joke. It's funny. Just like you were saying, when there's no one in leadership that's a trans person. Well, there is now.
Yeah.
One person.
And I think our movement has suffered because of that. Thank God that there are some trans people in the state houses to help shift the narrative. But, you know, our movement, I think, needs to be led by those who are most impacted by oppression. And I think that's trans women of color. In particular, Black trans women.
I mean,
Mm.
and even in thinking of the history of the Stonewall riots, trans women of color, Black trans women of color, held a major role in starting and fostering that movement. And so it's always so interesting. I reflect back on my experience coming out and reckoning with my internalized homophobia, like even my internalized transphobia, right? Because it was, I remember my parents saying things like, as long as, so that you're not a sissy or something, or they were so worried that somehow I was going to be emasculated because of my sexual orientation. And I think what, in that effort to survive it, I'm not justifying it. It's really easy to other our trans siblings, to say that, well, at least, to make ourselves feel better, at least then I'm not experiencing that, or it's usually, at least I don't act like that. And that's not okay. That's not okay. And so even for me, as a cisgendered queer person, I'm still having to root out my internalized homophobia and my transphobia, and really elevate trans voices and queer voices of color as I continue on my journey of learning and acceptance, and ensuring that I'm dignifying. When I look at my friends group and I'm like, why don't I have more trans friends? Like, that, I know plenty of trans people. Why haven't I invited this person over to have dinner with me? And so it reminds me and takes me back to the work of Brian Stevenson, that says, if we are to correct these injustices, then we have to be proximate to each other. And I think that has been one of the biggest failures around cis gay men, cis lesbians, is that we've also participated in minimizing trans identity's dignity into entertainment.
Right. No, you're right. And so many, I think about the trans youth who don't have supportive parents, who are being kicked out of their homes, and there's not enough shelter for trans youth. I worry about them. What are we doing for the babies who are on the streets, who are now learning how to hustle on the streets because they don't have anywhere else to go?
I mean, I'm going to take this time. If you're local here in Charlotte and you're familiar with the organization Time Out Youth, and what Dr. Robyn just said, if that strikes a chord in your heart, they have a program where you can sign up to sponsor queer LGBT youth who get kicked out of their homes and provide shelter for them. And so even if you're not in Charlotte, I would encourage you to look up your local LGBTQ organization. A lot of them are replicating these programs to provide access, especially for trans youth who get kicked out of their home and need transitional housing. So if you have that capacity, there's always help needed there to show love and to invite these kids in, to be like, hey, you matter and you have dignity too. So I just wanted to throw that in there as I thought about it.
And here in Nashville, the organization that works for trans youth is Launchpad. Great organization, works to house young people. And a lot of our cities and towns don't have adequate resources to house people indefinitely.
And so I mentioned when we first got on that, like, I was coming to this conversation a bit with a heavy heart, and talking about housing, even and issues with housing, just bringing in the broader context of the day and time that we're living in. We talked to Erin last week about her work with Activist Theology Project and somatics and embodiment healing. Can you tell us from your perspective about Activist Theology Project, but also I want to broaden the conversation to include sort of a broader range in terms of, as we talk about, for background, what happened in Charlotte over the weekend is Juneteenth, and there was a party and there was a drive-by shooting that happened in one of our historically Black neighborhoods. And immediately that was met with calls to address Black on Black crime. But really, think about these instances, that's just a dog whistle.
Mm-hmm.
It is to distract from actual issues taking place. And so then I think about trans women of color often having this exposure to the criminal justice system at disproportionate rates, and then linking that to housing, which is sort of how that connected in my brain. And so many people want to divorce the work of anti-racism and say, well, this isn't the work of anti-racism, this is a Black on Black sort of crime issue.
Right.
But when we start to talk about the effects of poverty, the effects of systemic racism creating oppression, how does activist theology work and project play into those dynamics?
So let me go back a couple years. I left my faculty post in Berkeley in 2016 and moved home to the South. I'm from Texas, didn't want to return to Texas, so came to Nashville and decided to launch my scholarship as a collaborative project. And so I founded the Activist Theology Project. And I knew that because I move in the world that looks like a white person and I'm educated, so I have these privileges, that I needed to work with other white folks who were committed to dismantling the same kinds of systems that I was committed to dismantling. Now we call it composting, to be more in line with transformative justice.
Okay.
But I knew that I needed to work with other white folks who I could invite to use systemic analysis and lived experience to do anti-racism at the intersection of a class analysis, an analysis on ability, sociocultural analysis, etc. And so when I founded the Activist Theology Project, I didn't know what it would be. I just knew that my scholarship needed to go somewhere. And so as things have gotten clearer, what we're trying to do is culture shift. But we can't do culture shift without naming what's actually happening. And so we do a lot of truth-telling, a lot of connecting the dots for people, that racism is also tied to class. And if we're fighting racism, we also have to fight poverty, not the poor. So the Activist Theology Project, as a collaborative project, as a movement, if you will, is designed to incubate and innovate these impressions, these imaginations, in such a way that it could create some change. We think that is best done through relationship.
Yes.
Because we can't change policy without relationships. But what I also know about white people is that they're deeply disconnected from their bodies, which is why I knew that I needed a somatic or embodiment perspective. And, met Aaron a year and a half ago and, quickly fell in love with them. But I knew that this work of systems changing couldn't be done outside of an embodiment perspective, like that social healing was part of somatics or part of embodiment. And so, like Aaron and I have done a workshop on somatics and social healing around what is the relationship of our body to the relationship of the work, and which is a different take on how some folks are doing it.
So that, for me, that was a little heady. So can you explain what that looks like maybe in praxis?
Yeah, so it looks like every Sunday we have embodiment practice. at 3:00, and Aaron leads embodiment practice, and we help folks get into their bodies. It means that we've held online gatherings for churches, and we do it through an embodiment lens. So, where are you feeling the anxiety in your body? How can we release that anxiety? Okay, I hear that you're feeling fragile and you want to go through a shame spiral. So, how can we stop that shame spiral and allow you to be present to this conversation? So, there's all these ways of thinking about this work. But I think that if we first don't know how to address it, the ways in which our bodies have internalized supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
we will only come away with talking points.
I was just saying,
yes, go. Yes, yes.
Erin, her Sunday classes is a couple Sundays ago I got to go to, and she did, we did this rocking movement in association with trauma. And being a mother and knowing there was part of it, we were doing padding of our skin, and knowing when you hold a baby, you're patting them, and your body, it's a release of that tension, of that trauma. And after doing several movements, after an hour with Erin guiding us, it was just phenomenal. And like, the images and the way my body felt, like, it just has stayed with me. And I just am so grateful. Like, I just keep learning about the somatics and how our bodies flow with our trauma, and it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
So highly recommend that work. We talked about when we talked with Aaron, talked about that exercise that we did at the With Collective, and just all of the amazing things that arose and came out of that. And so to know and to hear that you are integrating it in this way for justice. One, I'm still mind blown, and I'm still learning about it, and so it's like I don't even know what questions to ask, because
Well, let me say it this way. My new book is on embodiment and our bodies and democracy. I'm making the case that embodiment is the missing link to a healthy and whole democracy. That if we can change the relationship to ourselves, and we can change the relationship with one another, that those changes can so deeply impact our culture in a way that we can heal our wounds. But we first have to start with ourselves.
Yeah, and that's any therapist that you go to will tell you that. any people see me at the hospital, and I'm like, you have to take ownership of your health. You can't be fixing everybody when it's your body that is the one that is requesting the attention at this moment. And I think that there's this misguided notion in justice and in justice work that we have to burn ourselves out. We have to go and do for everyone else at the expense of our bodies.
Well, that is the grind culture, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
And that's motivated by capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just need to do away with that.
Yeah. And I find myself really struggling to, even as I'm trying to step into this anti-racism work and trying to do anti-racism work and all these other endeavors, still within the capitalist construct. And so it is, even in doing that work, it's like, because it's like, well, I need to eat, I need to do all these things, but I find myself like, oh, I didn't respond to that email, or I didn't, and so there's trying to find that balance of we have been putting it lately, is this contemplation and action, this divine sort of dance. Because if we're not well, if we're not in tune with our bodies, then we're just going to continue to perpetuate the hurt that was done to us.
Yes, that's right.
So I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question, because what keeps going through my head
Okay.
is the misnomers that a white culture hears when we hear take care of our bodies, and we intermix that with individualism, and we in turn center ourselves. And I feel like there needs to be a lot of breakdown of what individualism is and what self-care is, because our capitalistic society, our white society, turns that focus, and it becomes, and I'm so sorry, here are all my tears for all the bad things I did, I'm healing.
Well, this is the whole like American yoga phenomenon, right? Which is appropriating a spiritual culture, a spiritual practice from the subcontinent of India.
Yes.
Right? So this is a good question, because how do we teach white folks to center the felt sense of their body as part of their analysis around supremacy culture? What's also teaching white folks how to be in community with other white folks, which, I feel like white folks disconnect from their heritage. They just don't have a historical memory, and so they just check out. They just get disconnect.
Yeah. Oh, completely.
So it's first teaching how to be in community, and then while teaching that, teaching how to center the felt sense of the body, and then combining that with systemic analysis, right? Our lived experience, if we are not, I was listening to one of the things that Aaron watches these webinars all the time, and she did the somatic webinar, and the soma is the living body, and if we are not tending to the living body, then we are not tending to ourselves. So learning self-care is also tending to the soma, the living body, and that's the work that we are trying to do.
How, in your view, does tending to the living body connect us to spirit or divinity?
Well, my colleague says even when religion isn't the answer, spirit is. And I think probably, as I think everything is theological, everything is connected to spirit. And if we want to talk about the theology of God being in all things, that's called panentheism. And I would lean in that direction heavily, that God is in all things. And God is in the work of helping people get into their bodies. And whether we call that spirit or divinity or God, it's there.
That is, so then I guess that takes me back and makes me want to reconnect that and get a little more clear. So if God is in all things, from our earlier conversation about oneness and sort of this, I didn't hear you say distancing yourself from oneness, but like how does this theology of oneness and panentheism, or God in all things, then play out in all this, or are those two unrelated concepts?
Well, I mean, I think that people who are panentheist would advocate for a oneness. I want to advocate for multiplicity and for divine multiplicities, and I want to work for a world where we can each have a spiritual encounter that doesn't need to be categorized or explained, that it can just be. And that's when we get back to our ancestral roots and to our indigenous roots. Because Western religious traditions have created categories that require evidence for religious experiences. But when we reach back into our ancestor world, we might be able to learn some stories that transcend the rules of Western enlightenment.
Wow. And so it truly, you are interrogating and it sounds like dismantling the entire system that we function under.
Yes. That would be a yes. Correct. That is what I'm doing.
Whoa. Okay, like all right, this is permission to be, so I gotta ask, like, what fears come alongside that?
What fears come alongside that?
Yeah, like in a very tangible way, like
Oh,
who you are and how you walk. Like what? Like I would be terrified probably to even.
I'm trying to stay off the radar of the police. I'm not trying to get on their radar.
For sure.
Right.
Well, I mean, these narratives, these religious narratives, cultural narratives are very thick and run very deep. And so, I may be able to move the meter a little bit, but dismantling the system is going to take a community effort.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we are doing the best we can to educate folks and connect the dots for folks. I mean, I'm going to die trying.
Yeah.
And hopefully somebody will pick up this work when I'm gone and say it was worth something.
Yeah. I mean, it's what I see in your work is a very holistic work. It's tackling so many different aspects of our culture and how we live, and inviting us into imagining a new way of being, and that is. It's fantastic. It is liberating, and it's all the things that you went to school for.
Yeah. I mean, it's the work of radical imagination.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like if we can imagine the world we want, we can make it so. And it's going to take all of us to imagine the world.
Capitalism has kept our minds so busy that we imagine so little.
Yes. And to that point, the dominant culture just doesn't have an imagination.
Yeah.
Black folks have an imagination. Latinx folk have an imagination, right? I mean, so much of the community that I grew up around, their imagination, they were working somebody's land, and, they had imagination to make enough money to go back home and be able to survive, or bring their family here. But the dominant culture doesn't have the imagination.
None.
I was reading this interesting thing that talked about like children, when they have a plethora of toys to play with, those children end up being less equipped to use their imagination than those who have a few or the same toys to play with or repeatedly. And I guess that sort of leaves me at, I won't even say a place of conflict, just because it's not something that I've been able to think through in any meaningful way. But I'm just curious as to the psychology of oppression versus the psychology of those in positions of oppressor, and how that relates to this ability to imagine different things. I imagine like the oppressor is imagining like ways to continue to hold on to power.
Right. Well, I think about that as a mixed race person who has oppressor and oppressed it running in my blood. That to be a mestizaje person is to have both sides of the coin in you with some indigenous blood in you. And it's dynamic, it's fluid, and we should always work to decolonize the oppressor in us and decolonize what is oppressed in us.
Mm.
And that's also dynamic work.
Yes. So tangibly, you alluded to avoiding police.
Right.
And I know you've been having lots of conversations in this day and age on what imagining defunding the police could look like.
Yeah.
How is that playing into activist theology right now?
Well, we did a episode on our podcast where we talked about defunding, disbanding, and abolishing. And my co-host is on one, who is a cis white straight woman. She's on one side of the argument. Defunding, yes, but can we reimagine the police? And I'm on the side of defunding and abolishing, because I think that our modern day militarized police had its roots in the slave patrol.
Yeah. Yes.
Maintaining white order. And so I don't see any reason why we should have that in operation right now. So, but I'm an abolitionist. I think that we should abolish prisons and cages and ICE and
Yep.
so.
Amen.
Yeah.
you won't get no arguments from me on that.
Or me, like, we're with you. Get rid of it all.
Moment of vulnerability. I have found George Floyd happened, and then sort of watching the events unfold, and people started to pour out into the streets, and it probably was the first time in my life that I was like, I could really get arrested.
Yeah.
And there is some, I laugh when I say it, and I know that for me sometimes laughing is like a comfort mechanism, but I did really bump up against that realization as I'm marching with my people, marching with my tribe to say that this has to stop. This is enough.
Yeah.
And I've never had to reckon with that. And that was a different fear than I've ever had to experience in my life, because all of a sudden I'm thinking about, all right, do I have a plan? If I do get arrested, who am I going to call? I don't really know any numbers by heart anymore because I'm a millennial.
Right.
And then, oh my gosh, well, there's actually people getting arrested. Do they have the support that they need? And then that got me in contact with some local community activists, and all. It's amazing to see the work that's already been done, that has been being done over the years. And it feels like in this moment, we're being called to sort of give all of ourselves in some way. In healthy ways, of course. But I resonate when you say trying to stay off the police radar, because it's like, of course, I 100% advocate for nonviolence, and how I understand the language of a riot, though. I understand the language of violence. It's not something that I ever want to employ for myself, but it's this psychology that I can understand and say, this is from deep wounding that has not been addressed. And I found myself asking white people who would come in contact with me this question of, what are you willing to lose? And when I think about my ancestors and what they were willing to lose, at some point for me, that requires me to ask the question, am I willing to put my body on the line?
Right.
How does activist theology wrestle with that thought, or wrestle with that concept?
Well, I think that activist theology is designed to address violence and the overwhelming violence in this world and to advocate for nonviolence. But it also advocates to get your hands dirty. And sometimes that's not going to look like what we think it should look like. But at the end of the day, activist theology is about restoring yourself and finding the ways where story can heal the wounds that society has caused. And hopefully, by restoring yourself, there is movement to get in the streets, and there's movement to get your hands dirty.
Back to that rest and contemplation, rest and action. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Robyn, we had the honor of having you on as one of the very first guests of the Permission to Be podcast.
Yeah.
And that's been over a year ago.
Yeah.
How was the journey? I mean, at that time, your book was just about to come out, which is a phenomenal book, y'all. Especially the Audible version, because Dr. Robyn's reading it themselves. But what has changed since then for you?
Well, I think that the work has intensified, and learning how to organize and teach in any capacity online and to innovate online has been a huge learning curve. But with quarantine life and COVID-19, we've seen how disproportionately Black and brown folks are impacted. And so how do we communicate these disparities while also helping people to not be so fucking racist? You know? So
Amen.
the work is just a lot right now. And I mean, the things that have changed are I'm not on a plane all the time. I am on calls and Zoom and podcasts, and hopefully it will do some good in the world.
So, understandably, there is a sentiment that says this is just yet again another time where the white community is jumping on the bandwagon of what is currently on the media,
right?
With protests, and it does feel like people are truly listening, but you never know. What is your feeling about this time? If it's really, I mean, I know like you can't label it, but like I'm curious what your gut is saying.
Well, I had a call with my Enneagram teacher today, and my concern is that protesting and marching is being normalized because white people now care about it and white people are now out in the streets. And so I feel concerned that we're going to normalize protest and marching without getting material change. And so I'm paying close attention to what's happening to see when does policy change happen, when,
Yeah.
I feel like in this work, we have to be hyper aware of patterns. And what you just referenced is the pattern.
Right.
It is the pattern that also provides the breeding ground for the language of riots, for the language of violence, because it's inaction. And so for white folks listening, I hope you don't tire out, because this is a marathon. And I say that with exhaustion in my voice because I am tired. But I recognize that exhaustion is calling me to rest and recharge, to fight for another day.
Mm.
Because this is the work.
Yeah. This is the work.
So, Dr. Robyn, what... I don't know if we... This tells you how bad we are sometimes. Sometimes I forget to go back to listen to some podcasts, some of our episodes.
I don't know if we asked them on the first podcast or not. Honestly,
We've asked this question in a couple different variations, and however it comes to you, that answer is welcome and okay.
Okay.
What is salvation meaning to you today? And that can be salvation, liberation, deliverance, protest. What is this act of transitioning into something new, something more free, meaning for you today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the eclipse of liberation or freedom. I would be comfortable using those terms.
Mm-hmm.
And we see but a glimmer of hope in what's happening, but hopefully it will grow.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. And Austin Channing Brown words in the words of one of the last chapters of her book about hope dying resonates with me, and I've become more comfortable with aspects of hope dying because it always seems to give birth to new hope, to new energy, to new ways of thinking, creating, being, using the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, hope had died that white people would understand why people were kneeling, but it gave birth to a new hope when I saw white people on the streets in mass.
Yeah.
And as the protests go on, there's a bit of hope dying in terms of the change that we will see as the economy reopens up. There's hope dying for me, but it's sort of this continued process of death and rebirth that I'm experiencing in some way, somehow, that feels liberatory to me.
Yeah. I think hope is defiant.
Woo. Yes. Well, I cannot wait to continue to co-conspire with you.
Yes.
And to be on the front lines with you.
Yes, excited.
Whatever that looks like, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Also, you mentioned that you were working on a new book.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that for a minute, as far as like, where are you at in the process? Is it something that's coming sooner than later?
Well, the manuscript is due January 1st.
Okay, so it is sooner.
2021. We're in 2020 still, right? Yeah.
What is time?
So the manuscript is due next January. It'll probably be out the following spring.
Nice.
Yeah.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Robyn, we've done this before with you, but where can people find you?
So I'm on all the socials, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and I'm maxed out on my friends on Facebook. So if you can follow, I don't know why they cap it. Like that's so stupid. But
you can't be that popular,
right? But if you can follow my professional page, which is Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, and then on Twitter and Instagram, I'm at iRobyn, and that's the letter I, ROBYN.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah,
thanks
it's good
for
to be
having.
Here.
Yeah, thank you for an expansive conversation.
Yeah,
we went a lot of places.
Yeah.
We did, but it was amazing. Like, oh, such good conversation.
Till next time. Thank you for joining us on Permission to Be. I'm your host, Becka Epley, and thank you to my good friend and co-host, Tommy Allgood. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and you'll never miss an episode.
If you would leave us a rating and or review, we are always looking for more and more ways to hear from our listeners. You can find the links for today's guest in the show notes located at beckaepley.com.